Have you ever been judged solely based on your appearance? On a first-class flight, NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal faced ridicule and prejudice from an arrogant passenger. But what this man didn't realize was that Shaq wasn't just a basketball icon. He was a man with a kind heart, on a meaningful mission. Join us in this touching story where a chance encounter in the skies changed hearts and perspectives forever. Morning sunlight streamed through the large glass panels of the airport, illuminating the faces of hurried travelers moving through security checkpoints. Among the bustling crowd stood a towering figure, Shaquille O'Neal, the NBA legend. But today, Shaq wasn't donning the glamour of a sports superstar. He wore a simple gray hoodie, a low-brimmed baseball cap, and carried a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Everything about him was unassuming, mirroring the humility he embodied on this journey. Shaq was en route to the grand opening of a charity hospital for underprivileged children, a project he had poured years of effort into funding. This wasn't just a flight for him. It was a mission with deep purpose. As he stepped into the first-class cabin, Shaq sought no attention. He only wanted to quietly prepare for the work ahead. Settling into his window seat, he placed his bag in the overhead compartment and took out his tablet, ready to fine-tune his speech for the following day's event. But the calm didn't last long. Eyes from around the cabin began to turn toward him, curious glances mixed with skepticism. Some passengers whispered among themselves, while others exchanged looks, as though questioning his presence. Shaq noticed the unease, but he had grown accustomed to it. At the far end of the cabin, a well-dressed middle-aged man named Thomas Carter sat with one leg crossed, absent-mindedly turning the face of his expensive watch. When his gaze landed on Shaq, a flicker of discomfort and suspicion crossed his face. Thomas frowned, as though Shaq's presence in first class was some sort of anomaly. Shaq quietly opened his tablet, his focus on the speech he was crafting. But the silence was soon interrupted by a sharp voice that cut through the cabin. "Excuse me, are you sure this is your seat?" Thomas Carter's voice rang out, cold and probing, as his eyes swept over Shaq, scrutinizing him. Shaq looked up, his expression calm and composed. "Yes, this is my seat," he replied, his voice steady yet firm. Thomas let out a sarcastic chuckle. "Well, that's interesting. I didn't realize first class was now open to people like you." Thomas's words sliced through the cabin like a razor, leaving a heavy tension in their wake. A few passengers glanced up, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. But Shaq remained composed. Setting his tablet gently on the table in front of him, he turned to face Thomas directly. "First class, sir, isn't just about the seat," Shaq said, his tone calm but resolute. "It's about how we treat one another." The weight of Shaq's response hung in the air, silencing the cabin. Thomas raised an eyebrow, seemingly taken aback, but his arrogance wouldn't let him relent. Before he could respond, Shaq turned back to the window, his focus returning to his tablet. For Shaq, this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew tense after Thomas Carter's mocking remarks. Curious glances from passengers flicked toward Shaquille O'Neal, as if trying to determine who this towering man in simple attire was, and whether he deserved to be seated there. Shaq remained calm, his gaze fixed on the window, as though Thomas's words were nothing more than a passing breeze. But Thomas was far from finished. He stood up, took a few steps forward, and waved for the flight attendant with an air of superiority. "Excuse me." Thomas's voice cut through the cabin, loud and clear. "There must be some mistake. This man obviously doesn't belong here. I'd like you to check his ticket immediately." Lisa Harper, the head flight attendant, quickly approached. Her professional smile faltered slightly, replaced by a subtle tension as she met Thomas's demanding gaze. She turned to Shaq, leaning slightly forward, her tone polite yet tinged with unease. "I'm sorry, sir, but may I see your ticket?" Without a word, Shaq calmly reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved his ticket, and handed it to Lisa. His steady gaze met hers, as if to assure her he understood the awkward position she was in. Lisa examined the ticket, scanning its details carefully before nodding with certainty. "This ticket is completely valid, sir," she said, her voice firm yet courteous as she turned back to Thomas. Thomas raised an eyebrow, but instead of stepping down, he sneered. "Oh, perhaps this is some sort of special case," he said with biting sarcasm. "I assume he's sponsored or a guest of someone. But let me be clear. First class isn't just about having a ticket. It's about class, and some people simply don't belong." His words swept through the cabin like a cold wave. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable, but no one dared to intervene. Shaq remained silent. He calmly folded his tablet, placed it on the tray table, and slowly turned to meet Thomas's gaze. "First class, as you said, isn't just about the seat," Shaq replied, his deep voice steady and measured. "But true class is how we treat those around us." Shaq's quiet response landed with a weight that made Thomas pause. A heavy silence enveloped the first-class cabin. Lisa hesitated briefly, her eyes darting between the two men, then quietly stepped away, perhaps hoping to diffuse the tension. Thomas lingered for a moment, his face reddening slightly, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit defeat. He returned to his seat, though his eyes stayed fixed on Shaq, as if waiting for another opportunity to assert his dominance. Shaq let out a soft sigh, not in anger, but with a twinge of sadness. He had faced prejudice like this his entire life, and though it no longer surprised him, it still weighed heavily on his heart. This time, however, he resolved to be patient. He believed that change was possible if he could plant the right seeds. The cabin fell into an oppressive silence once more. The passengers could feel the tension hanging in the air between Shaq and Thomas. Although Shaq had responded with poise, Thomas's skeptical gaze remained locked on him, as if demanding further explanation for his presence. Then, piercing through the stillness, a small voice spoke from the back of the cabin. "Wait a second, is that Shaquille O'Neal?" The unexpected voice pierced through the silence, like a ray of light breaking through heavy clouds. Every eye in the cabin turned toward the source, a boy of about 10 years old, his face glowing with excitement and his eyes wide with amazement. Ethan, seated with his mother in the last row of the cabin, couldn't contain his enthusiasm. "That's Shaquille O'Neal. Mom, it's him. He's the one who built the charity hospital I read about in the news," the boy exclaimed, his clear, youthful voice ringing through the otherwise quiet cabin. Shaq lifted his head slightly, a gentle, warm smile spreading across his face. He didn't speak but gave Ethan a small nod, acknowledging the boy's words. The passengers began murmuring among themselves. Their expressions shifted, from curiosity and skepticism to astonishment and admiration. An elderly woman seated nearby spoke up. "That's right. I remember now. I read about him in the papers. He's an NBA legend and raised funds to build a hospital for underprivileged children." Thomas, who had been sitting frozen in his seat, heard the words as though they were a blow to his pride. Slowly, he lifted his head, his face rigid with shock. His eyes darted around the cabin, meeting the astonished gazes of the other passengers before finally landing on Shaq. In that moment, every trace of arrogance seemed to drain from his demeanor. Lisa Harper, the head flight attendant, also stood still, her eyes widening as she finally recognized the man whose ticket she had checked. "Oh my goodness," she murmured under her breath, quickly regaining her composure. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted completely. Passengers who had been silent now whispered excitedly among themselves. A middle-aged man turned to his companion and said, "I've heard about that hospital. He's not just an athlete. He's an incredible human being." Thomas remained motionless, but his face betrayed his inner turmoil. He lowered his head, as if ashamed to meet the gazes of those around him. Meanwhile, Shaq sat quietly, his calm demeanor unshaken. He made no move to gloat or retaliate against Thomas's earlier remarks. He simply remained seated, exuding the quiet dignity that defined him. A young woman seated nearby spoke up, her voice filled with emotion. "Shaq, you truly are an inspiration, not just on the court, but in life." Her words were met with nods of agreement, and a few passengers began to clap softly. Shaq bowed his head slightly, his gentle smile unwavering. But in his eyes, there was a glimmer of hope, that this moment wouldn't just bring a small change to the cabin, but that it would serve as a meaningful lesson for everyone present. After a few moments of stillness, scattered applause began to ripple through the cabin, growing stronger and more unified. The first-class section, which had felt cold and distant before, now brimmed with warmth and admiration. The glances toward Shaq had completely transformed, from skeptical to deeply respectful. Shaq nodded again, silently expressing his gratitude, but he maintained his humility. His gaze returned to the window, as if seeking refuge from the growing attention. Yet, no amount of composure could erase the embarrassment etched on Thomas Carter's face. The man sat stiffly, grappling with the consequences of his earlier behavior, his discomfort evident to all. Thomas sat motionless, his trembling hands resting on his knees. He kept his head bowed, avoiding the gazes of the other passengers. The arrogance that had served as his shield throughout the flight was now completely stripped away. Finally, summoning all his courage, he stood up and walked toward Shaq. "Shaq." Thomas's voice was hoarse, almost breaking with hesitation. I am truly sorry." The cabin fell silent. Every passenger turned their attention to Thomas, waiting to hear what he would say next. "I was wrong," he continued, his voice shaking. "I let my prejudice cloud my judgment. I judged you solely by your appearance, without realizing what an incredible person you are." Shaq turned to look at Thomas, his warm eyes showing no trace of anger or resentment. "You don't need to apologize to me," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "What matters is that you've recognized it. We all make mistakes. But what makes us better is how we learn from those mistakes and correct them." Shaq's words were not just directed at Thomas. They resonated throughout the cabin, a message for everyone. Lisa Harper, the head flight attendant, hesitated before stepping forward. She placed a hand over her heart, her face full of regret. "Shaq," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to apologize too. I hesitated earlier. I didn't stand up for you when I should have. That was wrong, and I feel deeply ashamed." Shaq smiled, a gentle and compassionate smile. "It's all right, Lisa," he said. "Tense situations often lead us to act in ways we don't intend. But what's important is that we learn from them." Lisa bowed her head, as though to thank him. Other passengers nodded in agreement, and an older man stood up, his voice filled with emotion. "Shaq, you're not just a great athlete, you're a teacher in life. I think today all of us here have learned something from you." Ethan, the boy who had first recognized Shaq, stepped forward, pulling his mother's hand. He looked up at Shaq with wide, admiring eyes. "Mr. Shaq," he said, his young voice ringing out clearly, "I want to be like you, helping people, no matter who they are." Shaq crouched slightly, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You can do it, Ethan," he said, his voice warm and sincere. "Kindness doesn't begin with grand gestures. It starts with the smallest actions, how you treat your friends, your family, and even strangers. You don't need to be famous to make a difference. You just need to be yourself." The cabin fell silent again, before breaking into applause once more. But this time, the applause wasn't just for Shaq. It was also for Ethan, a new generation learning how to be a better person. Thomas returned to his seat, but this time, his shoulders were no longer stiff with pride. His face had softened, and his eyes reflected gratitude as he looked at Shaq. Around him, the passengers exchanged glances of understanding, as though the cabin had transformed into a small, connected community, united by a profound lesson. Shaq sat back in his seat, his eyes gazing out the window, where sunlight pierced through the clouds. A faint smile crossed his face. He didn't need applause or recognition. What mattered to him were the seeds of change he had planted in the hearts of everyone there. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin now felt lighter than ever. The glances once filled with suspicion and prejudice had transformed into expressions of understanding and admiration. A sense of connection spread across the cabin, as if everyone on the flight had undergone a journey, not just of geography, but of the heart. Shaq sat back in his seat, but the calm didn't last long. An elderly passenger, who had silently observed everything from the beginning, stood up and walked toward him. "Shaq," the man said, his voice warm and emotional, "you're not just a legend on the basketball court. Today, you've taught us an important lesson about respect and compassion. Thank you for that." Shaq nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting gratitude. "Thank you," he replied, his deep voice steady. "But I believe the lesson didn't come from me. It came from all of us. It's about how we see and change our own perspectives. That's what truly matters." Thomas remained seated, but his eyes stayed fixed on Shaq. This time, there was no arrogance or defensiveness in his gaze. Instead, his face revealed both remorse and a newfound determination. Slowly, he stood up again and approached Shaq. "Shaq," Thomas began, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I don't know what else to say except thank you. I'm not just apologizing. I want to thank you for helping me realize something I'd forgotten. That a person's worth isn't in their appearance or status, but in how we treat each other." Shaq looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with understanding. "Thank you for saying that," Shaq replied. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but as long as we start, we can make a difference." Thomas nodded, his eyes reflecting determination. "I'll remember this lesson," he said, his voice now steadier. "And I'll work to be better from today forward." Ethan, the young boy, still stood nearby, watching everything with admiration. He turned to his mother and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Mom, Mr. Shaq is the best person in the world." The cabin erupted into light laughter, the sound mingling with another round of applause. But this time, the clapping wasn't tinged with awkwardness or curiosity. It was filled with genuine respect and heartfelt gratitude. Shaq turned to look at Ethan, his gaze resting warmly on the boy. "Thank you, Ethan," he said. "But you know, I'm only doing what anyone can do. What's important is that we always treat each other well, no matter where we are or what the situation." As the plane began its descent, the morning sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the cabin in a soft, golden glow. Shaq quietly stood, retrieved his bag from the overhead compartment, and prepared to exit the plane. Before stepping away, he turned to the cabin, offering a warm smile. "Thank you, everyone, for showing me that change is always possible, as long as we're willing to open our hearts." His words rang out as a gentle yet profound farewell. One by one, the passengers rose, exchanging friendly, empathetic glances with one another. Lisa Harper, the head flight attendant, bowed slightly to Shaq once more, her eyes glistening with tears but shining with gratitude. As Shaq stepped out of the cabin, sunlight bathed his face, as if affirming that his journey, not just on this flight, but in life, was far from over. He walked forward, carrying with him hope and the seeds of change that had been planted in everyone's hearts. Shaquille O'Neal's journey wasn't just an ordinary flight. It was a lesson in respect, humility, and the power of compassion. We've witnessed how a great individual used kindness and composure to challenge prejudice and open the door to transformation in others' hearts. If this story has touched you, please share it to spread the message of kindness and respect. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.